Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to American Medieval. I am very pleased to be joined today by Daniel Melleno, who is an associate professor of pre-modern history at the University of Denver. His recently published book is called Franks and Northmen, From Strangers to Neighbors. And I think we're going to talk maybe a little bit about Vikings and Northmen today. But until then, welcome, Daniel. Thanks for joining us.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So, as people who've listened to the show before know, I like to start out with kind of maybe a silly question, but I think it's something that all of us, anybody who studies the past, historians, medievalists, maybe not especially, but I think we all get these types of questions because it involves time machines. And the question is specifically, let's imagine for a moment that we have a time machine. That time machine has been kind of given to you, Daniel, to use once on the condition that you have to go back in time to talk to a young Daniel, a childhood Daniel Melleno, and tell them that someday you will grow up to be a medieval historian. How does young Daniel react to that news?
I think young, well, that's interesting. Let's say young is let's say 14. Does that work?
Sure. Whatever age you imagine. Yeah.
If it's that age, I think very excited.
Okay.
Not surprised, but that's not exactly what I thought I was going to be, although I thought I was going to be some form of teacher. In my goals to be a poet. Medieval historian turned out to be a much more practical choice than poet.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I think he would be pretty excited. I got into history and medieval stuff from the standard, Tolkien et al. Video game type stuff.
Okay. All right. So fantasy lit video game stuff like that. Okay.
Pretty early.
Pretty early. Okay. So early teens. So nothing before then though. Because when I've asked this question before, everybody has there's a thread somewhere in their past, but everybody has a different age that they respond, what they think of when I say kind of childhood. And so early teens is very common because if it is kind of Tolkien, kind of fantasy literature, video games and stuff like that, it makes a lot of sense in a certain sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably middle school age is really when I started to get into it. I was always sort of into it. My parents were both big readers. I was raised Catholic and Jewish, so I had, there's some decent pre-modern elements of both of those sort of baked in. So I had that. But yeah, I mean, there was a time when I was younger where I thought basketball player, and at 5'6", that one didn't manifest.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think by the time I was in high school, that was pretty much. It was clear that I was going to be a high school history teacher, right? That was to bankroll my literary career.
Your literary career. Okay. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Well, I mean, still time, right? For the basketball career, but probably went the way that I was going to be the first baseman for the New York Yankees for a certain amount of time until I realized I couldn't hit a curveball. So that ended my baseball career real quick right there. And I had to pursue other means. But it's interesting, too, that you had this kind of literary interest or interest in literature, I should say, perhaps, and then an interest in teaching, right? Because, I mean, those are obviously kind of elements, even though, you and I went to the same graduate program, specifically in history, though at different times. I realize our listeners cannot see this, but I am much older than young Daniel here. Yeah, just ancient. So it did not overlap. But a history program, but one that I think is not kind of a straight up history program in a lot of ways, has kind of an attentiveness to other disciplines, especially kind of literature in some ways. And I think you see that in the scholarship that we produce. Because especially when you're talking about the Middle Ages, disciplines kind of, you use the sources you got, man.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think those kind of interdisciplinary things the interdisciplinary stuff is very interesting, and the idea that there are rigid lines between disciplines in early medieval history seem a little old-fashioned in some ways.
Yeah, I agree. I was talking to someone about Leeds, our big European medieval conference, which I'm hopefully going to be at in the summer. But, the idea of a medieval studies conference, right? Where there's 3,000 people, and you have very little in common with quite a few of them. Like, it's 1,000 years plus. It's
Yeah.
archaeology and literature and comp lit and linguistics and history. And there's a lot of angles you can take on it. And I think the more you can get in on different stuff, the better the work will be, and the more interesting it is.
Yeah, and I think there's, as you said, like I mean, we're dealing with kind of a paucity of sources in a lot of ways, especially for the Middle Ages, but for the medieval Europe kind of generally. But then there are, I think those different approaches oftentimes kind of bring value too. So I'm wondering too if your interest in kind of fantasy literature have you felt that kind of continue in? Because the Tolkien thing is very common kind of
Yeah.
amongst medievalists, right? The Tolkien interest. But then you did choose a history program rather than kind of a literature program. So,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
a little bit more uncommon, I think, than most Tolkienists or Tolkien aficionados, perhaps I should say.
Yeah, so I actually got fully into medieval because I went to a sort of a weird undergrad. I went to Sarah Lawrence,
Okay.
which is like a tiny little college where you don't have a major and you sort of design your own
Oh, all right.
curriculum. It's a
Yeah.
little less sort of wild than like a Hampshire or an Evergreen where like there's no rules at all. But it
Yeah.
was like you took the classes you wanted to take.
Mm-hmm.
And the first class I took there, they called it first year seminar. Most colleges have
Sure.
some way of onboarding first years,
Mm-hmm.
was a medieval lit class.
Ah, okay. Okay.
We read Beowulf and Dante and the Fairy Queen, which haunts me to this day. And it was wonderful. And also, like, very quickly on, I realized that I liked things maybe a little more firm than literary studies sometimes
Okay.
is comfortable with. Like, I can't help but veer towards the firmness of history, which is not to say that history doesn't have lots of room for wiggle, but, I like to ground things a little bit more in facts and names and dates, perhaps, than some of my colleagues in literature do, which is not, it's just an angle that you approach on. And
No.
it was wonderful. And also, like, I found myself more interested in what kingship meant when I was reading Beowulf than the sort of like metaphor, the
Yeah.
thematic. Those are still very interesting. And I think they're really important ways of engaging with the text. But like, I couldn't help but keep wanting to ground it in a sort of more concreteness of social and cultural history.
Yeah, and Beowulf's a really interesting kind of test case, and I mean, I don't want to kind of wade into all the controversies about
Mhm.
Beowulf necessarily. I mean, that'll be another separate hour, maybe sometime.
Yeah.
But I always teach it in my own courses, which are in kind of history and religion here, where I teach right now. But it's also super interesting because it's part of the standard K-12 Commonwealth of Virginia curriculum. So the students have all kind of read it, or at least they have theoretically, or kind of skimmed it or talked about it.
Encountered it.
Exactly. And almost all of them kind of hate it. And I think it's my job in some ways to make them love it because I love that poem. Like that poem just kind of rules in a lot of different ways because there's so much more going on. And it's so much fun to work with them sometimes to defeat the first encounter that they've had with it, which is oftentimes very kind of structural, right? Like, this is the structure of the poem. This is kind of what it's about, with kind of square quotes around it. And, this is what we can kind of learn from it. And just to show them how much more is kind of going on with this really weird kind of very early medieval poem.
Yeah. You asked about fantasy, and I actually just finished a class on the concept of barbarian with Conan.
Yeah.
This class is a fun one. We start with Gilgamesh and then work our way all the way to the modern period, sort of hopping and skipping and looking at the way different cultures sort of use this concept and how they build on it or change it. And so it's fun to bring in Howard and bring in the original Conan short stories and the movies and, look at all the permutations of it. But like for me, Beowulf, I use it in my medieval travel course.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. Even though it's an angle, I use it alongside some of the Old English poetry to sort of like think about like what this text can tell us about how they might have thought about the hall and the wilderness and the swamp and the need to go to places to accomplish things versus like staying safe. And, so it's much more about the sort of thematic lens or angle that you can get with these texts than it is, right, the structural or the like that sort of approach,
Yeah.
which is in some ways a very literary way to think about it. But again, my goal is to sort of use it as the entry point to think about what is the culture and society of early medieval Europe,
Hmm.
and like how does travel help us understand that? Yeah.
Yeah, I had never thought about Beowulf that way, but that makes kind of perfect sense because nobody ever stays anywhere in
Yeah.
Beowulf. Like everybody's moving all the time. Like sometimes the journeys are relatively short, but sometimes they're quite long, like across the sea and to different places and stuff like that. And it kind of defeats in some ways a very common kind of popular conception of the early Middle Ages, especially, right? The quote unquote Dark
Yeah.
Ages, that everybody just kind of stayed in their village and never went anywhere or did anything kind of ever.
Yeah. That static Middle Ages. Yeah.
That static Middle Ages, that nobody left their village for 1,500 years. And yet somehow we have, gardens from Sri Lanka that show up, in England in the early
Yep.
Middle Ages and places like that. So just magic teleporting, apparently.
Yeah.
We're not carried by people in any way. So
Well, the objects move, but nobody moved them, right?
that's right. That's right. It was like a long chain of people throwing things kind
Yeah.
of from village to village, just, well, they stayed the same. But, to kind of get off Beowulf, I mean, Beowulf is kind of connected to your own research in some ways. And I would love to talk more about kind of the idea of the barbarian. That, of course, sounds so interesting, especially because we're seeing kind of a resurgence of that kind of rhetoric.
Yes, we looked at some of that.
I'm sure you did. I mean, you are very aware, as everybody should know, kind of what's going on in the world. Your research kind of focuses on another group of early medieval peoples, right? Like people
Yeah.
that we oftentimes call the Vikings, and specifically, your book Franks and Northmen, about kind of stuff that my own work has kind of touched on, the Carolingians, the Frankish world, but they're, the encounter between those and people outside, specifically to the north and Scandinavian areas and stuff like that. So how did you kind of first get interested in kind of that topic? Like we've talked about kind of Tolkien and then kind of to medieval literature and then kind of early medieval kingship and things like that. And then you wind up in Scandinavia kind of generally.
Yeah, I sort of did an odd loop because I started with that medieval lit course and then I did a year in Oxford in my junior year
Okay.
and sort of skewed much later. And when I applied to grad school, I thought I was going to do like a 100 Years War project.
Okay.
But what I was specifically interested in was interaction and conduct.
Mm.
So I was very interested in these like stories about somebody being captured in a battle and then it's just like living in England or France for like X number of years, just sort of like deadly enemies, and yet they're like
Yep.
having court fits and like and
Just kind of
parties and
hanging
like
out.
they're
Yeah.
right, like until they get ransomed back. And then as I was sort of thinking about that as a project, as will happen to many people, I found out that somebody else was like in the imminent stages of publication on that and was suggested I look
Yeah.
elsewhere.
Worst thing that can happen to a grad
Yeah,
student, right?
it happens.
Yeah.
And one of the places that I started looking was the Carolingians, in no small part because our shared advisor is a Carolingianist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was just sort of a natural place I was spending a lot of time, even as I did other poking around. And the same sort of question was still, I think, really valid, which is like, how do these people treat each other?
Mm.
Right? Our sources really paint them as like diametrically opposed, right? A lot of our sources paint the Northmen or the Vikings as like inhuman monsters. Like our earliest sources basically don't even give them human agency. They paint them as like a plague.
Yeah.
Basically. Like they could just as well be locusts or hail or whatever, right?
Yeah, like a force of nature in some ways, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And like when you actually start to poke at the sources though, you still find those weird moments that don't fit with that, where there's a ransom, where there's a marriage, where there's an alliance. I mean, the most famous sort of Norse Viking place other than Scandinavia is Normandy, right? It's like this place in France called Northmanland that was like an arrangement wherein a guy, named Rollo, probably, maybe, probably not, made an arrangement with the king of the Franks to like settle down.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, how does that work? Like, we all know that happened, but like, how do we get to these diametrically opposed, bitter enemies, like making this arrangement?
Yeah.
And sort of, if you start to pull the thread on that, you find, oh, there's lots of these moments.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like all over the place. And in point of fact, like if you poke at the sources, the first interactions are not violent at all.
Mm.
They're like political, they're diplomacy. The very first interactions are like Charlemagne, Charles the Great, sending envoys to the Danes because he's dealing with the Saxons, and the Danes are on the other side of them. And that's like 30, 40 years before the first Viking attack is recorded,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's like, wait a minute, that's a different story.
Yeah.
There's still the violent story, but that's even more interesting because then you're like, well, how do you like square the violence with the other interactions? What's their relationship between them? How do you move
Mhm.
from one to the other and back again? And that sort of stuff. And that's really like sort of what caught my interest, was that like
Yeah.
much wider set of interactions, including the violence, but also like putting it into the context of trade and intermarriage, diplomacy, mercenary service, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So a much richer, more complex picture of the relationship between these two groups, right?
Yeah.
And please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it seems like a lot of the certainly the popular conception, but even some of the scholarship, like it still tends to veer kind of when they're talking about the Northmen, widely between like, oh, they cared about nothing but war, or they were actually kind
Yeah.
of peaceful traders, and it was interrupted by kind of skirmishes or
Yeah.
raids or something like that. So and not to, we don't want to be kind of terrible centrists and just say, well, the truth is just kind of plops somewhere in the middle or something like that. But I mean, it is the historian's job, right, to add nuance to
Yeah.
those types of stories, right? Can you walk us through maybe just a little bit about kind of why do Americans kind of think of Vikings in this way? Like, it's one of those things, like if you
Yeah.
ask the average American kind of on the street, like, tell me like one or two things about the Middle Ages, like they're going to probably mention the Crusades, Black Death, and maybe Vikings. And then maybe Fall of Rome kind of in there as well. So like Vikings occupy a space in American minds. So
Right. Well, and the way you put it, a space in your mind is, I think, a
mhm.
really good way to put it. Because, like, I start pretty much any class where I'm dealing with the Vikings with, like, the question, I'm like, can you picture a Viking?
Mm,
Right. And, like, everyone can.
yeah.
And then I like to play with them. And I'm like, okay, can you picture an Almoravid? And no one
Yeah,
can,
yeah,
right? Like, that's a very specific niche, like Iberian Muslim, like, context. Can you
yeah,
picture a Thuringian? Can you picture a Neustrian? Like, I could do this endlessly, right? And you can't.
yeah, yeah,
So what is it about the Vikings that not only have we heard of them, but that like you have an image in your head,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, I say Viking, and for better or worse, you think horned helmets,
Hmm.
which are of course not real. And like, that's almost part of it now, is that people know
Sure.
it's not real. So they're like, that's like a part of the thing, is like knowing I know a thing that's not real and I know a correct thing, right?
Yeah.
But like, we have an image in our head. It's iconographic, right?
Hmm.
And that's, Crusaders, incidentally, are another one that people can do that with.
Absolutely.
Like they picture the bucket helm and the cross on the tabard or whatever. But like, that's not norm, or maybe it is normal, but it's not ubiquitous. Like, there's lots of historical periods and peoples that you can't do that with.
Yeah.
And you can with Vikings.
Hmm.
Like, they are in our heads, they occupy real estate. And I think it has to do with a couple of different things, some of which are very medieval and some of which are not at all medieval,
Okay.
right? From the medieval perspective, we're actually talking about two medievals. So there's the Viking Age, which runs like, let's say 750 to 1050, 1100 or so,
Okay.
right? There are Vikings around, Vikings are pirates, but also we could, shift it and say it's the Norse Age, or the Norse diaspora is a very common way of thinking about it in
Hmm.
academia now. This period where people from Scandinavia are out and about doing stuff. But all those people from Scandinavia are pre-literate. So they don't have written language, right? They
Mm.
maybe have rune alphabets that they're using for certain very specific types of, work, rune stones being the most famous. But beyond that, they're not writing stuff,
Hmm.
which means that every single source we have about the Vikings from the period where there are Vikings is, with very few exceptions, written by an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And those outsiders are very often monks being raided by Vikings, right? Like, those are the guys who write. They're almost always monks,
Not their biggest fans.
and they're not the biggest fans of Vikings. So what we get is a stereotype, right?
Yeah.
This iconographic image of this scary Viking, this larger than life, like sometimes quite literally larger. Like, there are these sources that say like the largest men that we've ever seen or whatever. These like tall, scary monsters.
Yeah.
Well, that's very iconographic, right? That sticks in your head. We like monsters, we like boogeymen, we like scary, fierce stuff. If we then jump forward to another medieval thing, but not the Viking Age, in Iceland in the 12th through roughly 14th century,
Hmm.
you have these Icelanders who are the descendants of Vikings, right?
Hmm.
And they're writing about their past. They are now literate, and they're literate in both Latin, which is the sort of big language that everyone's writing in, but they're also literate in Old Norse,
Mm.
which is their vernacular. And they write down all these memories, basically. They write down the sagas as well as some other stuff, skaldic poetry, Eddic stuff, right? And they're writing about their ancestors, right? So
Mhm.
the sagas are by and large stories of the Viking Age.
Yeah.
And when we write about our ancestors, right? Instead of writing about scary people, we write about heroic people. We write about
Yes.
cool adventurers, and they go out and they're still Vikings, right?
Hmm.
So they're still raiding and they're still getting into fights and they're still doing violence. But also, they're more than that, right? They're heroic, adventurous people. Sometimes they're not Vikings, right? Like the guys going to Vinland, which is in the Americas,
Hmm.
are not
Hmm.
Vikings. Like per force, they're not. They're not raiding. There's no raiding in
Yeah.
either of the two sagas of the Vinland sort of trips. But they're still adventurers. They're still going off,
Sure.
right? So we have these two sort of correlating or fitting together source bases. We've got the like scary, intense Vikings, and we've got the cool, adventurous Vikings,
Yeah.
both of which are iconographic.
Hmm.
So they make for great storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Then you boil that down over centuries and centuries, right? And Vikings are a big, like in the 19th century, in Romanticism, in nationalism, when people are starting to think about what makes us English or what makes us German or what makes us Danish or whatever, right? Vikings keep coming up. They are sort of part of the English history because they conquered swaths of England. And,
Sure. Sure. Sure.
you know, they're part of German history because Norse stuff is really the only pre Christian Germanic stuff we have.
Hmm.
Because again, those Icelanders wrote down a bunch of stuff that nobody else wrote down
Yeah.
because they came to Christianity late and they came to Christianity by choice. Like we don't have any old German paganism or very, very little,
Yeah.
right? So all that pre-Christian Germanic history got lost when the Carolingians conquered the Saxons. But you can sort of imagine that Odin is close enough,
Hmm.
right? He's probably Woden and, it's Wednesday and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that sort of is when Wagner is, of course, the big guy who gives us horned helmets, is writing his big Germanic operas like the Ring Cycle. He's going to like these Germanic stories that go all the way back to pre-Christian stuff. And a lot of it is Norse or Norse adjacent.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so 19th century loves Vikings. That unfortunately, Nazis love Vikings.
Yeah.
Like that's an unfortunate sort of element of it. So Vikings really start rolling again in the modern period as these sort of cool medieval origin stories about adventurers.
Yeah.
The American stuff then comes in a variety of ways, partly just because media,
Yes.
right? America produces media. And so if you're making movies about medieval stuff, you might make some Viking movies.
Yeah.
But also, America has like a couple of connective elements. I mentioned Vinland.
Hmm.
So there is a Norse presence, albeit a very small, limited Norse presence in North America around the year 1000.
Hmm.
So that's like a thing that people in America can sort of attach themselves to.
Yeah. A connection back to Europe in some way. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, a connection back to Europe, a creation of sort of a past that goes back
Hmm.
even further than Columbus, a sort of like a legitimization, but also like, this is something we all talk to our students about. Like, there's a lot of history out there, but the history we tend to care about is the history that is related to us,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
So, the place where students, for instance, encounter the Vikings, because students don't get medieval stuff usually. I mean, maybe like we said, they get Beowulf
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's, again, related to us because it's the English epic.
Yep.
So it's part of our history, right?
Sure.
But like nobody learns about 1066. Nobody really learns about the Carolingians. Nobody learns about medieval history that's not related to them. But because Vikings came in the Americas, suddenly it's worth learning about.
Yeah.
Whether you're, putting it into your narrative of discovery or whether you're trying to unseat Columbus
Hmm.
because he's, out of fashion and you want something better or whatever. Like it's related to us, so that gives us a hook in again.
Sure. Yeah. And there's something kind of imaginative about it, right? So
Yeah.
the way that the sagas are presented, right, is that these are stirring tales, right? Like
Yeah.
lots of interesting stuff kind of going on, especially like the Vinland sagas, encounters with clearly Native Americans.
Yeah.
There's also this weird kind of betrayal within the Norse
Yes.
community
Yeah.
there that leads to disaster and stuff like that. I mean, really just well written, interesting stories.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if it is because the Vikings have this kind of polarity to them. It allows people to kind of use their imaginations as
Yes.
there's a flexibility to that
Hmm.
character, right? Like it can be the bloodthirsty monster or it can be the dashing, heroic kind of adventurer.
Yeah. And there's a lot of that. Again, in part because they're not real.
Yeah.
In as much as like all of the literature and all of the sources that create our Viking are already somewhat fantasy based,
Hmm.
right? Like even when they're like historical, they're still like shaped by these sort of high emotive narratives, right? But also because, as you say, like if we say Norse instead of Viking, that actually better captures the sort of breadth of the culture. But it is like it's a culture that involves raiding, but also exploring and trading.
Hmm.
And again, like if we think about like American values, Vikings fit pretty well with a lot of the things that American identity likes to espouse. So we can see how, like, if you're into like expansion and exploration and frontiers, Vikings are a great sort of story to tell yourself,
Yeah.
right? Like if you're pushing westward, well, Vikings pushed westward. That's us. We're like
Yeah.
Vikings, right? If you want to tell a story about capitalism and economic, vitality and the daring market man, like
Hmm.
Kings will do that. If you
Yeah.
want to be, like hyper violent, masculine warrior guy, hey, Vikings will do that. But also, if you want to be an egalitarian feminist, warrior, well, you've got, Lagertha and you've got Un the Deep Minded and you've got like these, like, frankly, quite unusual for medieval sources images of women
Yeah.
doing stuff that, if you actually dig into it, is pretty medieval. It's not modern feminism, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But it has the roots of a more available sort of set of ideas about gender that you can latch onto, right? So, like, I just finished a class where we look at sort of modern medieval mythic stuff.
Hmm.
And we looked at, I don't know if you talk about it in Bright Ages, but you've talked about it, the Burka grave, BJ581
Yes. Uh-huh.
is this grave that was regendered based on new scientific techniques and discovered to contain a female body.
Hmm.
And it has weapons. And there was a pretty heated debate about whether this was a warrior or something else, or,
Hmm.
it really spun out quite a bit. But what was really interesting about this debate is that, like, you had hyper, like, misogynist groups and hyper feminist groups, like, both trying to lay claim to the Vikings
Yeah.
at the same time. Like, you have a tug of war over what a Viking is.
Yeah.
So it really is flexible. It really is like anybody can make use of Viking stuff.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of that debate, which I do remember, and it was particularly heated like on Twitter because back in
Yeah,
old Twitter and
in
stuff
the
like that. But
days.
in the days before it became what it is now, shall we say, which is not a good place. It was a historical debate, right, among
Yeah,
scholars about kind of what is this grave? What is this doing? It's a weird grave. It's interesting in its own way, in its own right, but it's also became kind of a political flashpoint.
yeah,
As you said, kind of not just kind of a cultural one, but really about like what does it mean to be a Viking? What did it mean to be a woman in a medieval society? And it brushed up against kind of a lot of people's assumptions
yeah.
and expectations. Thanks for listening to our podcast, American Medieval. And if you like the show, that's great. It also means, however, that you'll like another of Multitude shows, Spirits. Spirits is a history and comedy podcast focused on folklore, mythology, and the occult, told through the lens of feminism, queerness, and modern adulthood. Every week, mythology buff Julia and her childhood best friend Amanda get together to learn about a different story over drinks. That's everything from the mythological origins of franchises like Lord of the Rings and Wonder Woman to modern urban legends to a roundup of werewolf stories from around the world. Start listening with any of the more than 450 episodes they've released over the last 9 years. Dive in at spiritspodcast.com or search for Spirits wherever you download your podcasts. Now, back to the Middle Ages. And so I'm wondering too, like, because what we've been talking about so far has been primarily written sources.
Yeah.
But there's been a ton of archaeological work that's been done specifically in Scandinavia in the world of the Norsemen. I remember teaching my intro medieval class, and I was given like my one lecture kind of on the Norse world. And I made some joke because I was showing something on a PowerPoint about like a recent archaeological discovery. And I said something, I was just like, man, it seems like every time they turn over a rock in Scandinavia, like they find like a Viking hoard or a Viking grave or something like that. And I said, like, I mark my words, by the end of the semester, there'll be 10 more that'll be in the news. Daniel, there were 20 more.
Yeah,
there were
absolutely.
20 more, like just in that 6-week period or something like that people found them. So is archaeology kind of changing the field as we think about kind of Vikings, as we think about Norsemen, or is it just kind of helping us better understand, if that distinction kind of makes sense?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
It is a growth field, right? Like, it is kind of fascinating, again, as a historian who first and foremost is a text-based scholar, right?
Sure.
And that's one of the things that distinguishes history from, archaeology at its most basic. And obviously that's a little bit surface level, but
Of
like,
course.
it's unlikely that we're going to find very many more text sources about the Norse. Maybe one or two here and there could happen. You never know what's buried in an archive.
Sure.
I'm still praying someday there's this amazing letter from a guy named Ratramnus to a guy named Rinbear about dog-headed men in Scandinavia. And we don't have Rinbear's initial letter. And so, like, I'm praying someday someone's going to find the first letter that Ratramnus is responding to.
Just buried at the back of a chronicle somewhere or at the end of a manuscript. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be somewhere, right? It existed, but like, probably not.
Yeah.
But archaeology is like a place where they are finding stuff, right? All the time. Sometimes it is like, there was a story a year or two, maybe it's 10. These time
doesn't matter anymore. Yeah.
right, of like a girl who found a sword in a lake behind her house.
Yes.
Right? Like, I'm so jealous. Right? Like, as an American, like, I got lucky. I found, like arrowheads sometimes. That was pretty cool. But like, you're not going to find a coin hoard,
No.
and you're not going to find a Viking sword.
No.
So like that stuff, but also like big excavations, right? One of the places that I spend a lot of time talking about in my book and in my research is sort of a market town called Ribba, which is in the Jutland Peninsula, sort of up far north. And it's been studied for quite some time. Like, it's been a known, very important place for over a century at this point. Like, there have been excavations going back into the 19th century. But they just, like, a year, 2 years ago, finished another major excavation and found all kinds of new stuff, right? Like, because they have to do them in these very sort of constrained spots,
Sure.
right? You can't, like, there's a town on top of it, so you can't be like, everybody leave, we're destroying this town so we can get to the Viking stuff, right? So they like pick a spot and they work on it, and it like uncovered all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And, some of it was like confirmation, right? We knew this was a place where they made glass beads, and we found a lot more glass beads. But some of it is like, okay, there's been this debate about when this town actually became a town, not just like a place where people gathered every once in a while to trade.
Yeah. Permanent settlement. Yeah.
A permanent settlement, one of the first permanent urban sites in Scandinavia. That's a big deal. Scandinavia doesn't have urban sites before the Viking Age, because it's not in the Roman Empire, basically. So like being able to figure out like, okay, did this all start in the 8th century or the 9th century? Like, that sounds a little bit like fiddly to a certain extent, but that's really cool data to be able to have a conversation about.
Yeah.
Right. And being able to say like, okay, there's people at this site or another site that like live there permanently who are probably Frankish or Frisian.
Oh.
We can say like, okay, these houses were probably foreign merchants living permanently at this site. That's a big deal. Like, again, if you're talking about how Scandinavians learn about the wider world and become part of it, like, that's part of that conversation.
Yeah.
So having that archaeological data is really cool. in the same way, like, so numismatics, the study of coins,
Hmm.
this is one of those things where like Scandinavia has metal detectorists just like out there looking for stuff
Hmm.
and they find it, right?
Yeah.
Like 10 years ago, it was like, oh, there's like 50, I'm making these dates up and these
Sure.
numbers up, but broadly, right? Oh, there's like 50 Carolingian coins in Scandinavia. So clearly not a big deal. Like in the early medieval sense, that's actually kind of a big number, but like still, that's nothing. But like now we're like, okay, there's several hundred. And again, these are the ones we're finding,
Sure.
right? Like that's indicative of a much broader sort of thing going on. And that's happening because of people just going out and looking for stuff. And the way Scandinavia works, when you find something, this is how England works as well, right? The government pays you and takes it. So it gets into academic circulation
Yeah.
much more actively than some places where they don't have those laws.
Yeah.
So that's cool. The other thing about archaeology is that it's like becoming scientific, right? Like for better or worse, right? Like in some ways, that's like, I think a debate within the field itself is like, is this a social science or is this STEM? Is this a hard science?
Mm.
And that's an identity sort of conversation that I think archaeologists and anthropologists are having. But like being able to say, like, oh, this person drank water in England. And we can tell that because we can take her teeth or his teeth and
Yeah.
see what like the calcium deposits tell us about where they were from. You couldn't do that 20 years ago. That's crazy.
No, you could not.
Right?
No.
Like
Yeah.
that's a whole different story, right? Like this isn't Viking related, but it's like tangential. The question of like how the Angles and the Saxons entered England and, like
Hmm.
took over. Was it an invasion? Did they kill everyone? Was it like just 10 guys? What was it, right? That's like one of these debates that early medievalists have been having for hundreds of years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Centuries. Yeah.
And they just like a year or two ago did, again, genomic sampling of a bunch of burials. And we're like, oh, there's intermarriage. There is very clearly intermarriage here. And you can't use the objects to tell whether somebody is British or English, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
Germanic or, Brittonic or whatever.
Yeah.
You can actually now go and say, like, oh, there's Germanic objects in a grave, but this person is genetically at least X% English.
Yeah.
That adds a whole new way of thinking about this stuff. That's really cool.
Yeah, no, I think that's really fascinating. And it's really great when this type of work kind of supplements or complements kind of work that
Yeah.
historians are doing, right? And I think there's, we've all encountered, and I'm sure you can think of examples too, in which kind of more scientific minded kind of archaeology comes in. They kind of run roughshod through things and
Yeah.
they're making assumptions about the period, to publish their results in the same way that, like I think it just really kind of speaks, as we were talking about kind of at the very beginning, the need for this interdisciplinary work is for historians to work with archaeologists, with people who are able to do kind of ADNA testing or
Yeah.
things like that, and sort of really get at kind of, well, what's actually going on with this grave site or this hoard or, kind of whatever is being found. I do want to go back to the coins though for a minute, if
Yeah.
that's okay, because you'd mentioned about like, so we're seeing more archaeological discovery showing Frankish coins specifically.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about kind of that? Because I think that gets at kind of your research, right? But also, the idea that there was trade that involved coinage is not something that's kind of well known about the early Middle Ages. I think there's a kind of perception that's kind of about barter economy. And again,
Yeah.
as we were joking about at the very beginning, right? Like people didn't move with their coins, but clearly they did. So what can you tell us kind of about the interactions between the Frankish world and these Scandinavian settlements? Was it kind of a political kind of thing? Was it a cultural thing? Was it simply kind of trade as far as we can tell? Why are these coins moving? Why is there evidence of kind of Franks in these spaces?
Yeah. So it's kind of all of them
Okay.
in some really interesting ways. So the way that the early medieval sort of trade economy works is that it tends to be funneled through sort of specific sites. They're called emporia
Okay.
or emporiums, depending on how Latin you want to be. So these sites where like everyday stuff is made. Like I have a cow, I need a X, Y, or Z. Like maybe you do barter or you trade or you
Yeah.
set up sort of like informal credit relationships, right? Like so and so took this from me last month. Next month, I'll ask for something from them. But then if you're doing like long distance trade in luxury goods or even like non-luxury goods, but like goods that are, not your everyday stuff, That's probably going to happen at these trade sites.
Okay.
And they tend to be on sort of border spots where they can be regulated and taxed.
Mm.
And that's especially true in the Carolingian Empire. And the big one that I care about and that most sort of Norse Viking scholars care about is Dorstad,
Mm.
which is in what is today the Netherlands. And this is like a site where basically, if you are from the North Sea, so let's say especially Scandinavia, and you want to trade on the continent, this is probably where you're going to go. It's in what is called Frisia, which is this like is the Frisians are sort of the great traders of the early medieval world.
Okay.
The term, in fact, is like synonymous. Like sometimes people will just say Frisian instead of saying trader because they mean the same thing
Okay.
in their minds. So these Frisians are part of the Carolingian Empire. Like many of the neighbors of the Franks, they're conquered and integrated over time. But by the Viking Age, have long been part, and they have a coin economy. They have a coin economy, in fact,
Mm.
before they're Carolingian. They are these little tiny coins. I was shocked when I actually saw them in person because I'd only ever read about them and seen pictures, and you don't get the scale of them. And they're like
Yeah.
they're like smaller than a penny. They're like
Mm.
dime or smaller size. These silver coins that are minted specifically for trade. They're called shates or sheta, or sometimes skate. And they're just made for trade
Hmm.
because they're little and they're silver and they don't have king's heads on them because they're not minted by a king.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of them. There's like a whole, like if you get into this deep, you learn about like, oh, there's porcupine and monster Woden, and they're all named after like the symbols on them. And different places mint their own, basically. So, like they're minted in England at various sites, and they're minted in the Netherlands and in Francia, and then they're minted in Scandinavia,
Ah.
which is really cool because Scandinavia is a pre-coin economy until this point.
Okay.
So the trick, though, is that they're only minted at trade sites.
Ah. Okay.
So there's like these four or five, there's sort of a fluctuating number. There's like everyone can agree on four of them. And then there's a question of like, is Aarhus one of them also?
Mm.
But there's like a couple of places where they start to be minted because the Scandinavian people there, or maybe the Scandinavian elite lord, jarl, whatever, who's in
Hmm.
charge of that territory, and it realizes like, oh, this is how you do trade and attract traders. They want to use coins. They don't want to barter because they're not going to stay there,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like they want to have like a fungible, movable silver thing that they know they can trust the weight of and carry it back and forth. That's how they do it in Francia. And we want to be like the Franks, which is to say we want to be rich and powerful and right, like and
Yeah.
all that stuff. We would like to be able to serve wine at our tables to show everyone that we're rich and powerful. When all our buddies come around, we have glass beakers instead of horns or whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So coins are a way to sort of do that, right?
Hmm.
So you end up with these like localized economies. Everybody like beyond the town is still using non coinage based systems. But if you're in the town, you're using coin based systems, which means that like Carolingians or Frisians can bring their own coins, which are silver, and trade with them. And also maybe when they're traded in, they're melted down and turned into the local coin.
Sure. Yeah.
That's pretty common, right? Like, and that's probably one reason why, in fact, we don't have like piles and piles of foreign coinage. Whether we're talking about the Carolingians, right? Like, we know that there's a lot of trade with, for instance, the Middle East. And we would love to see all of the sort of Arabic silver dirham coming in, but they're actually melted down at Dorstad and reminted into Carolingian coins.
Because silver is a scarce resource, right?
Yeah, right. Like, and so we start to see that in Scandinavia. The other thing then that we see is that like Carolingian coins are found at trade sites, right? Like that's the place where they're
Mm.
typically found, and they're found very differently in trade sites than in other places because they're lost coins, right?
Mm.
Which is kind of a wild thing to think about given how important silver is. But like
Yeah.
when we find them at trade sites, we find single coins that have been dropped or lost or whatever,
Sure. Yeah.
as opposed to hoards, which when we find a hoard, we're like, oh, somebody probably stole those
Yeah.
and collected them. That's a very different way to think about coins. Or we find them in burials and they're turned into little like amulets because they have crosses on
Sure.
them.
Hmm.
So maybe like that person is using a coin not as money, but as like a way to sort of signal an identity or a belief. Because with the merchants, so comes Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so these trade sites are the site of economic exchange, but also cultural, intellectual, religious, spiritual exchange as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah. This is really fascinating about the way that coins are being used is similar to the way that we often use, money today, but also that it's kind of multivalent, right? Like it can be
Yeah.
used in different ways, that its iconography meant something.
Yeah.
Because if these coins were kind of the same value and you could use them at an emporia in England or on the coast of Francia or in Scandinavia or something like that, right? The idea that you would melt them down and make them your own like does suggest something important about the ability to mint things where you are, right?
Right.
But also too that these emporia, like the economy is just fundamentally different there than it is in inland sites, that they're so outward facing, that they're so interconnected among these different things. I mean, again, it just kind of, we were talking about travel earlier, is just like these people were moving, like, and everybody knew that, and that was okay, and that was expected, right? Like
Yeah.
the local Yar wanted like a glass beaker, right? Like he knew that somebody was gonna come in from somewhere probably pretty far away with a glass beaker at some point that he could somehow get his hands on.
Yeah. And then he can distribute them to his friends
Yep.
and show his power again because like it is this combination, right, of like a coin economy, but it's still a gift giving economy where
Hmm.
like your ability to like hand out shiny objects to your followers is really important, right? Or to somebody who's higher status than you, right? Being
Yeah.
able to like show those relationships. Like it's not just we pay money, we get objects. It's sometimes you pay money and you get objects, and sometimes you steal objects, and
Hmm.
sometimes you exchange objects to show your relationship between
Yep.
people. And these are all happening at the same time in these really complex, kind of awesome, cool ways.
Yeah. But these Emporia too, I mean, they seem like kind of really interesting I don't want to say ethnic, but lots of different peoples, right, were oftentimes in these spaces. You were talking about kind of people of Frankish ancestry probably showing up in these Scandinavian places. We could tell by some of the archaeological finds that they were there along with the objects that were found. But they're not always like safe spaces. And I remember like when David and I were talking about Oathbreakers, I mean, one of the big things that happens in the 840s is a raid. Quentovich, if I'm remembering correctly, right?
It's one of them. Yes.
It's one of the biggest, right? In which all of a sudden, like the rules of the Emporia kind of break down, maybe, right?
Yeah.
And it's sacked. Like so. So could you talk about like because we've been talking about kind of nice Vikings. Like I do want to kind of get at the raids a little bit, at least
Yes. Yeah.
acknowledge that there was some violence involved when we're talking about kind of the Norse, at least in the 9th century.
Yeah.
There, so
But you mentioned Quentovik is sort of another big Frankish emporium. It's more
yeah.
like English facing, but Dorstad is like raided over and over and over again.
Mm,
It's one of those funny things where it simultaneously shows us the violence of the Vikings, but also shows us that our sources are maybe a little bit overwrought because they're like, they raided Dorstad and they burned it to the ground. And then they do it again the next year. And you're like, how burned to the ground was it if Vikings can raid it five
yeah,
years in a row, right?
yeah,
Like, clearly, like either they're very robust, and to a certain extent they probably are, but also, right, Vikings are probably burning some things to the ground.
that's right.
But
Yeah,
they don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, right? They want this site to be there, in part because they use it to trade also,
yeah,
right? This is one of those like really like problematic elements of Viking stuff is that you don't actually know who you're going to get on any given day. So the first ever recorded Viking attack, which is actually in England, it's somewhere between like 787 and 789. Like the sources sort of dated a couple different ways,
sure.
but it's in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. And the story is essentially that these Danes show up and the local sheriff, the Shire Reeve,
Mhm.
rides out and is like, hey, the town's that way. You're in the wrong spot. You need to sail down. Because again, trade has to cycle through these
Yeah,
spots.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then the Vikings kill him and raid the area.
Oh.
But like he doesn't realize that they're not traitors.
Yeah, it seems like he expects them, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, there's a ship. I recognize kind of what's happening, and then all of a sudden, the axes and the swords come out. So
Right. And like that's the first, and again, I say recorded because almost certainly there were raids happening
sure.
before this got recorded. But that really highlights the sort of like unsureness, right? Like, are these Norse here to trade or are they here to raid us?
Hmm.
Or a little bit of both, maybe, right? Like, and again, Dorstad is sacked like on the regular, like annually for several years throughout the 830s.
Hmm.
And then again, like periodically, multiple times until it sort of disappears. The thing is, like, we used to think, oh, Dorstad disappeared because it was raided so much.
Hmm.
But actually, now we think it mostly disappeared because the river shifted.
Oh, it wasn't useful anymore. Yeah.
It just wasn't like an economically viable site anymore because of
Hmm.
the flow of the river. But even then, right, like Viking attacks on trade sites are like incredibly common. We see it in Scandinavia too, even. Like, again, we have very few sources there. But one of the sources we have is by, I mentioned Rimbert. Rimbert is the sort of second guy to a guy named Ansgar, who's the first missionary to the north.
Yeah.
Not technically, but sort of,
Yeah.
right? Like, he's the guy who tries to really Christianize the Norse people with very little success overall. But Ansgar spends a lot of time in Scandinavia, and Rimbert, after Ansgar dies, writes about him. He writes a Vidai about his life, and we get all of these like secondhand or sometimes firsthand, because Rimbert also traveled to Scandinavia a lot,
Hmm.
stories about Scandinavian life, and the life we get is by and large life at the trade centers because that's where the
Sure.
missionaries went.
Yeah.
And so he tells stories about like the people of Hedeby and of Burka getting attacked by other Scandinavian pirates. And like,
Mm.
obviously, because it's a Christian miracle saint's life, the sort of story is shaped through the like, and then they all prayed to God rather than the Norse gods, and God saved them from the pirates or
Sure.
whatever.
Yes. Yes.
But it's still like, it's really interesting to get a glimpse of like, oh, they're raiding everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
there are Norse raiders, Vikings attacking Viking trade sites for sure.
Hmm.
Because again, that's where wealth conglomerates. That's a great place to find wealth, right?
Yeah.
Like, so like we get a sense that like raiding is a big part of this.
Yeah.
It seems like trade probably precedes raiding
Sure.
based on the archaeological and text data, right? Like, we know that these trade sites existed before any references to Viking activity in the texts
Hmm.
by decades, right? But it seems like once you start to learn that there's this big wide world out there filled with people with wealth, sometimes the way to get that wealth is to trade, and sometimes the way to get that wealth is
Is to raid.
to raid. And like, it's funny, the TV show Vikings, the History
Hmm.
Channel show, which I'm, it's 90% responsible for me having a job at all, because it hit right as I was going on the job
Yeah.
market. Thank you. Starts like the very first episode is like, there must be land to the west. No, there's no land to the west. You're a fool for wanting to sail to the west. And it's like, he knew there was land to the west. Like, there's no doubt they knew there was land to the west. They were trading there. And like, so the first episode, or the second episode is the attack on Lindisfarne.
Yeah.
And you're sort of like, okay, that's a fun way to start. But also this like conceit that the Vikings didn't know that England existed is crazy
Yes.
because they've been trading there for decades at least.
Yeah.
And then that tip over into raiding occurs for a variety of reasons, not least of all because like it is a martial culture.
Yeah.
Like, raiding is something that you do. Like, that's part of how you get stuff. That's true if you're a Viking or if you're a Frank or an English person or whatever.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that you were saying kind of raiding happens in Scandinavia, like amongst the Scandinavians, because that also kind of goes against, I think, a pretty common conception that the Vikings or the Norsemen were homogenous,
Mhm.
that there was kind of one group of Norsemen and they attacked kind of other people. And they show up kind of everywhere. They raid into eventually kind of into southern France and into Italy, and then they wind up
Yeah.
in Byzantium and then become the Kievan Rus because they raid, eastwards as well. But they're fractious, right? Like, because Danes are different than Swedes and Norwegians, and there were different kind of polities involved. And there were tensions. Again, back to Beowulf. Those guys are just fighting with each other all the time.
Yes.
Just all the time.
Right. You've got Shield Danes and you've got Est Danes and
Yeah.
you've got, yeah, I mean, right. Like, one of the things we're seeing in the Viking Age is the sort of gradual centralization and sort of move towards what we would think of as kingdoms.
Mhm.
But that is like an ongoing, messy process with lots of hiccups and lots of breakdowns. And they're constantly doing different sort of arrangements to fight
Yeah.
and to figure out who's going to be in charge this week. And, like, again, one of the reasons we have Vikings at all is because of that process. Because, like, on the one hand, if you're an aspiring king, one of the things you're going to need to do is prove that you're a good king. And that means proving that you're a good warrior,
Yep.
but also being able to hand out all that wealth.
Yep.
So you go out and you raid and you bring it back and you hand it to your men, and more men hear about it and say, oh, guy
Yeah.
sounds like a really good king. I'll go fight for him. But now you've got more men, so you need to go out and raid more, right?
Yeah.
On the flip side, if you're one of the jarls who loses to that king, well, you can knuckle under. Maybe, you like swear fealty to him and become, one of his men. Maybe you die, or maybe you're like, no, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Right. And off you go. And well, what are you going to do with yourself and the men who decide to follow you? You're going to go raid.
Yeah.
Maybe you're going to set up shop in the Orkneys or in Scotland or in Ireland, or you're going to go all the way to Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like maybe you're going to go to Francia and you're going to see if you can find, a spot there. Cause like one of the things we see is that Dorstad, the great big market that then is raided, is handed over to Norsemen. It is like we're talking decades before Normandy is founded. There's this proto Normandy centered on Dorstad given to a Norse guy who happens to be the nephew of a failed king in Scandinavia. So
Mm-hmm.
his family loses the sort of kingship battle,
Yeah.
and he goes to the Carolingians because the Carolingians tried to sort of puppet state things, right? They supported his uncle.
Yeah.
And when his uncle lost, well, now the family is sort of like, we can't go back to Scandinavia, or we can try. They try
Yeah.
multiple times to go back, but they get set up at Dorstad because at this point, Dorstad is like sort of on the wane. And the Carolingian kings are like, you know what? Let's give them this spot that doesn't matter economically as much as it used to, and they'll serve as a buffer against other Vikings.
Yeah.
Right? These are our Viking friends.
Yes, Vikings fighting Vikings, like use them
absolutely.
against one another, and they're often too happy to do that too. And the other thing too is that it's so interesting that one of the things I learned as I was writing Oathbreakers and from your own work, especially like learning this stuff, is about how this goes back to kind of that silly conceit of the History Channel show, right? Is like how interconnected and how well versed like these guys knew what was going on, right? Like so many raids into Francia happened in the 830s and 840s because they know there's chaos. Like there's other stuff going on kind of in Denmark, but they know that the Frankish armies are otherwise occupied killing each other. And so this is a prime time to, kind of strike back against kind of the empire across the border.
Yeah.
And they're aware of that stuff, right?
Yeah, they're very savvy, right? And again, some of them are allies with Frankish kings, right?
Yep.
Lothar has a Norse ally, and like in the sources, there's these little references to like so and so raided this place, like in these sources. And if you know what you're looking for, you're like, oh, that's this guy.
Yeah.
Right. Like they won't even sometimes call him a Norseman, but like the name is the name, right? And you say, oh, that's this guy and he's here. And that corresponds with this other source, right? And again, it is like they're not homogenous. They're incredibly savvy. Like going back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Like things we like about Vikings, right? Like they are like savvy, but on the other hand, they're multicultural, right? They are like perfectly willing and happy to sort of shift what they're doing based on what suits them the best, right? Like we all like the stories of berserkers who just like run around, with their axes. But like those guys, if they even existed, are the outlier. Like what we should be thinking about is like savvy Norsemen who like are willing to change stuff to like fit in, not just take advantage of stuff, but like, make choices that will get them safety and all the things that humans want, right? Like it's just in a medieval context. So violence is a lot more centered than we might be comfortable with. But like they're still just trying to like figure out how to make the best of the situation.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, like violence is always a part of the conversation, but like if you put the Norsemen up next to any other group of medieval people, a polity or a culture, like you're going to find very similar things. It's not like the Franks were just sitting around kind of twiddling their thumbs writing poetry. They were sitting around twiddling their thumbs writing poetry, but then they were also out killing lots and lots of people, doing things like raiding into neighboring polities in order to get booty that they can distribute to their followers in order to build alliances and keep, prop up kingships and stuff like that. So,
well, and again, that's one of the sort of like ironies of the whole situation is that the Carolingians feel and this is true of the English as well, feel it's vitally important that they distinguish themselves from the Vikings because
Hmm.
actually they're not that different.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's true both culturally, but also like linguistically. Like the
Yeah.
big thing that separates them is Christianity.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that they emphasize, oh, those guys are pagans.
Yeah.
Those are heathens,
Yeah.
and we're not.
That's bad stuff.
Because if they
Yeah.
don't have that,
Yeah.
like,
Things get really squishy. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are starting to run out of time. I did want to ask you one more question before we go, though. And I know because we did talk a little bit about the History Channel show, The Vikings, but if you had the chance, like, to make another Viking story for unlimited budget, major motion picture or TV show or something like that, do you have something kind of in your mind that you would go to?
I mean, I'm obsessed with this family that I sort of mentioned in passing, which is like the Harolders. They don't have like an official name, so I've coined
Okay.
the family of Harold. And it is like it's a very sort of like Game of Thronesian sort of story of this like
Hmm.
attempted dynasty that like just never quite gels. And so they spend a lot of time like bopping in and out of the Carolingian system and like
Hmm.
thing around and desperately trying to like find their angle in. And it all comes crashing down in the 880s when sort of the last member of this dynasty marries a Carolingian princess.
Ah,
Now, admittedly, she's technically like an illegitimate princess, right? She's
there were lots of those bopping around too. Yeah.
gets
Hmm.
very complicated. You know all about the Lothars and the
Yeah.
Lothars
Yeah.
and the Lothars, but he makes this arrangement with the king of the Franks,
Hmm.
with the emperor of the Franks, in fact, and then falls prey to inter-Carolingian rivalry because he marries this Carolingian princess, and her brother is an illegitimate prince who desperately wants his father's kingdom and ends up trying to rebel against the Carolingian king with this Viking sort of as a tool of that. And they get caught and they get slaughtered. And like, this is like cinematic stuff.
Yeah.
It's one of those things when you ask that question, like if you had a time machine, I thought you were going to ask and could see anything.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
Like, I want to go to that wedding because it's not documented anywhere.
Yeah.
Like, what must that have been like? What is this wedding with a Carolingian princess and a Danish warlord
Hmm.
and his followers, and all the Carolingians are there. And again, they're not that different, but also they're pretty different, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and he gets Christianized as part of the condition of marriage. So, like, they don't probably know what's going on with all this church stuff, right? Like, that would be cinematic, right? Like,
Hmm.
seeing that wedding and then the fallout and all the like internecine rivalries and plots, and they invite him to a conference because they're like, hey, we know that you're interested in this stuff, please come talk to us, and then they ambush him and kill him while he's like sitting there. That's cinematic. Like, make a movie out of that.
That is cinematic. Yeah. There's a minor bit there too, which is just like, that's a great thing, is to go back and see a wedding like that. A, for the weirdness of that one specific one, but also because, and this was another thing kind of like figuring out as David and I were writing Oathbreakers, is like, we know so little about weddings,
Yeah.
about marriages. Like what was it like? Don't know. Nobody cared.
Yeah. It's these like big unwritten elements that get referenced, but they're not
Yeah.
important enough. And so like, you never get to see them, right? Like, what is a Carolingian wedding like?
Yeah.
You could do that with anyone. Like, what was the deal with Louis and Judith, right? Charles the Bald's mom, right? Like,
Oh,
much
yeah.
younger bride, like,
Yeah. Supposed beauty pageant, which is not
Right.
maybe, probably actually a literary illusion, but still like super interesting. And like, and especially because how much of like early medieval politics generally, not just kind of royal politics, but aristocratic politics, is about marriage alliances and who's wedded and who's legitimate and who's not, and how
Yeah.
those relationships are established. And we just know like so little about like,
no, it's so frustrating.
yeah, it's very frustrating. So
There's always like, that's being a historian, especially in early medieval studies, like
exactly.
questions you'll never get to answer. I want to know
Son of
about
a nutcracker.
translators,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like, they're mutually intelligible, but there's all these like diplomatic conferences that get referenced
Yeah.
in passing, and I'm like, what does that look like? That's what
Yeah.
I want the sources on, is like,
Yeah.
what does a diplomatic conference between Vikings and Franks look like? Do they sit at a table? Is there a pitcher of water that they're all passing out?
Like, how is communication happening, right?
Yeah.
Like, who's in that room? Like, who's doing that translating? So you get like hints of these things, but it's just like, yeah, it was just like the thing that everybody knows how to do. So, well, I don't know how to do, man. You got to tell me. I'm living here 1,200 years
Please.
later and I want to know. So think about that for future historians as you're writing things down.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are unfortunately out of time. This has been really great. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us.
It was a real pleasure.
If people do want to learn more about you or your work, how can they find you online?
I have a slightly outdated website that I should probably update now, which is danielmelleno.com.
Excellent.
Again, I have a book out. It's somewhat niche and scholarly.
It's a good book.
Please feel free to read it. I did an AMA on Ask Historians on Reddit about my book, so you can always check that out. And in general, should be checking out historians on Reddit because it's
absolutely,
a brilliant place in general.
It's a great community, yeah.
And yeah, that's where I'm at.
Okay.
And if you're at DU, come take a class with me. I'm teaching on witches and wizards next quarter.
Fantastic. I mean, you have the best titles of courses, man. You're talking about barbarians and myths and witches and wizards. Like, this is awesome. So, well, thank you again for joining us, Daniel. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of American Medieval. Hopefully we'll see you next week. And until then, take care. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schifini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.